Very warm welcome back, everyone, to the third and sadly final day of the Nature-Based Solutions Conference 2022. For those of you who are lucky enough to be here in Oxford, I hope you enjoyed your drinks and conversations among the dinosaurs and the lights and the sounds last night, remembering that we do need at least some fossils in our life. So we covered a lot of ground yesterday. But an emerging theme, I think, from the talks was that key barriers to effectively implementing, scaling up and mainstreaming nature-based solutions includes a lack of knowledge among decision makers and land owners and land managers of the true and the multiple values of these very precious ecosystems on which we depend. And in particular, lack of knowledge about how these benefits are distributed and the ability to be included in specific funding streams or for specific resource streams. So addressing this in different ways through different lenses. Today we have 5 really interesting sessions. So after the coffee break, let's see. Okay. After the coffee break, we have this session, Economics of Nature-Based Solutions, moving from evidence to decision-making and policy finance and infrastructure investments. This is brilliantly convened and chaired by Erin Gray of the World Resources Institute. And this will present some of the latest evidence on the extent to which nature-based solutions can deliver economic development through enhanced water security, food security, and climate change adaptation. And it will provide a range of contrasting expert insights into what works and what doesn't work for moving economic evidence into action with public and private stakeholders. So these talks are going to begin with an overview of those key societal challenges that NbS economic valuation can address, and the key challenges and opportunities that economists face in motivating stakeholders. And then through 3 very different contrasting case studies, speakers will explore the economic valuation and biophysical modelling approaches, equity, inclusivity considerations, and best practices and opportunities for scaling up nature-based solutions. So that's a session directly after the coffee break. The second session, which is chaired by Dustin Garrick of the Smith School and Daniel Morchain of the Nature Conservancy. This looks at the potential of nature-based solutions for addressing food and water security practices, largely in agricultural landscapes, while supporting ecosystem health and sustainable livelihoods. So this session is going to explore the potential of nature-based solutions to enhance water storage and supply and quality to support food production and livelihoods through nature-based practices such as agroforestry and regenerative agriculture. And again, we've ensured that the case studies are included from diverse contexts, drawing on successes and struggles. And in the lead, it's sort of very important in the lead, I think, and particularly up to the next COP27 of the UNFCCC, which is taking place in Egypt. You know, there's an important to have a focus on global experiences, especially within the context of Africa. So then, at the same time, so we have parallel sessions, so don't forget to sign up to these. I'm particularly excited about session 8B, just because this is quite a big focus of our work here in Oxford. This is going to be chaired by Rosie Hales, who is the Director of Science and Nature at the National Trust. So we know that landowners and managers can make a major contribution to meeting the UK's target for net zero emissions for climate change adaptation and nature recovery through adopting low-carbon, nature-friendly land management practices. And this is all, it has that potential to do that, despite being against the backdrop of all sorts of crises, including rising inflation and energy prices, labour shortages, and a huge deal of international uncertainty and complex geopolitics. So it's how do you do that, given, you know, how do you scale up nature-based solutions against the backdrop in a country like the UK. So it's going to explore the practical steps the UK government could and should take to facilitate the shift in line with its 2050 net zero target and its upcoming climate change adaptation strategy. So looking a bit at the opportunities around the new environmental land management schemes in England and other targeted financial support and regulation, including the role of private finance. So that's going to be in the Oxford Martin School. So do sign up for that. I think that's going to be quite popular. I know there are lots of us here that are working in the UK context with considerable challenges to face. The afternoon or the final session, so there's two sessions running in parallel. 9A is on business, biodiversity and nature-based solutions, is convened and chaired by my absolutely wonderful friend and colleague, Cécile Girardin, as part of her role as founding director of the Oxford University Social Venture Nature-Based Insetting. So we have a real diversity of speakers from a broad range of different sectors who are going to discuss the regulatory landscape emerging around business and biodiversity, and whether things like the task forces for climate, nature, and inequality-related financial disclosures will actually do what they're intended to do, and that is shift financial flows away from harmful outcomes. So speakers are going to highlight the challenges of setting and meeting robust, ambitious, yet achievable net zero and nature-positive science-based targets, and explore approaches to reducing, offsetting, and insetting impacts, including through the implementation of high-quality nature-based solutions. And that session is going to take place here. And finally, and extremely importantly, I think we have a session looking at nature-based solutions in the context of the urban environment, which is, after all, where most people, most humans will be living by the end of the century. It's really essential not to overlook the incredible importance of integrating nature within our urban and peri-urban landscapes to build resilience and build well-being. So we're very honoured to have that session chaired and convened by Harriet Bulkley, the Professor of Geography at the University of Durham, also project coordinated and oversaw the Horizon 2020 Naturevation project that involved a large team of researchers from multiple institutions across several European countries that looked at the role of nature-based solutions in responding to the urban sustainability challenges. So there's going to be an overview of the latest global evidence on this, but then we'll also be looking at diverse case studies highlighting what the enablers are of successful implementation in the urban context and reflecting on the challenges of mainstreaming nature-based solutions into urban development. So again, do sign up for that one. That's also in the Oxford Martin School. Okay, so that's a lot of really interesting things that we have and interesting questions that we have to explore today. But now it gives me a huge pleasure to introduce our final keynote speaker of the conference, Professor Edward Barbier, who is the University Distinguished Professor in the Department of Economics at Colorado State University. Really delighted to welcome you here. It's wonderful you could find time to take part in this event. So Ed's main expertise is in natural resources and development economics, and he's done an awful lot of work and thinking on issues at the interface between economics and ecology. A real big theme for today. So he's consulted for a variety of national, international and non-governmental agencies, including many UN organizations, the World Bank, the OECD, and has been extraordinarily productive with over 300 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and has written or edited 26 books, all on environmental and sustainability issues. The latest being recently out, Economics for a Fragile Planet, published by Cambridge University Press, and more information, and I believe copies of this you can find outside in one of the stalls in the gallery. So please, if I can hand over to you now, Ed, and if we can put Ed's slides up, that would be great. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you, Professor Sutton, for that wonderful introduction. So what I'd like to do in my keynote today is talk to you about some of the challenges and opportunities of the economics and financing of nature-based solutions, which it is, of course, the big theme for this day of the conference. And for this keynote talk, I'll be drawing on some of my recent work, including the book that I've just produced that Natalie mentioned. In this book, I'm attempting to explain how economics needs to be rethought as a solution. If we want to use economics as a solution to a whole range of global environmental risks, we have to rethink our markets, governments, and institutions, and I try to provide a way forward. I was also asked recently to provide a review of the Dasgupta Review. Partha Dasgupta at Cambridge wrote for the UK government an economics of biodiversity, and I tried in this review article to explain how some of his main themes can translate into policy, particularly for managing land use and biodiversity, which of course is an important aspect of this conference. And then finally, last year for COP26, Joe Burgess and I were asked to write a report on the economics of peatlands for the Global Peatlands Initiative, which was launched at COP26, and I'll be drawing on a few of few examples from this report for this keynote. So our reason for concern is, of course, the global crisis in land use change and biodiversity loss. And this global crisis is really captured in three major trends. The first is that in low and middle income countries, many of which are tropical, agricultural land has increased by 40% since 1970. Meanwhile, since 1990, we've seen tropical forests decline, and they are continuing to decline, and even at a faster rate since the pandemic. And then, of course, biodiversity is now only 30% of what it was 50 years ago. And the implications of this is very dire for our planet's biodiversity and ecosystems. Terrestrial ecological communities have lost more than 20% of their original biodiversity. Natural ecosystems have declined by almost half over the past 50 years, and are approximately one quarter of all our terrestrial species are now threatened with extinction. And of course, this has also contributed to climate change. Land use change is now accounting for at least 14%, and many believe this is an underestimate, or at least a lower estimate, on the carbon emissions caused by global land use change. And not even protected land is safe. Estimates suggest that as much as 1/3 of already protected natural land is under intense human pressure. So we clearly are facing a global biodiversity land use crisis on a huge scale, and not even protection seems to be working to stop this. My view as an economist is there's something fundamentally wrong with our economic approach to nature. And I believe where we need to go is captured in Partha Dasgupta's report. And what we really need to do, if we want to talk about solutions here, we must change our economic approach so that we make sure that our economies are not attacking nature, but are embedded within it. So economies should no longer be considered external to nature. We should be thinking about ways in which we embed economies within nature. And that's been the focus of some of my work. From my standpoint, the reason we are failing to do this today has to do with two major problems in our economies today. And I call that the underpricing and the underfunding of nature. The global risk posed by land use change and biodiversity loss can be traced back to these two economic failures. And that's what we must attack if we want to start embedding economies within nature. Let me start by explaining what I mean by underpricing of nature. So essentially, as many of you in this room know, as experts on nature-based solutions, is that most of nature's valuable goods and services, the benefits they provide to humankind, they're provided for free by nature. They do not appear in our markets, and they're largely ignored in policy and business decisions. What is more is that we actually pay many economic activities to destroy nature. We have effectively put a negative price on nature. We're saying nature's not worth it, let's encourage more businesses to do more environmental destruction. So we subsidize economic activities to destroy nature. And just to give you one example, the OECD for 50 countries estimated that in these countries, environmentally harmful subsidies just in agriculture amount to around $112 billion annually. To put that into perspective, that's what the entire world, public and private, spends each year on protecting nature globally. So we are essentially in 50 countries subsidizing environmentally harmful destruction equivalent to what we're putting back to protect. Or to say it differently, if we took away those environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies in these 50 countries, we could use that money to double nature protection. But the scale of the problem is even worse. The negative price of environmentally harmful subsidies across all sorts of industries and all sorts of countries amounts to $1.8 trillion a year. That is subsidies for fossil fuels that are environmentally damaging in agriculture, forestry, water, and so on. And to put that into perspective, $1.8 trillion is just about how much Canada generates in all the value of its goods and services each year. So think about that. We are actually paying industries, giving money to industries to environmentally harm the environment, destroying its valuable goods and services. That's equivalent to how much Canada produces in its economic goods and services every year. So this vicious cycle of underpricing nature is at the heart of the problem that we face in trying to move to an economy that's embedded in nature. Because essentially, as long as we go on doing this, providing subsidies for environmentally harmful activities and not also controlling the damages that other activities do, we're going to face loss of ecosystem goods and services, and those losses are not reflected in our markets, our policies, or our business decisions. Human impacts on the environment will therefore increase. If we're ignoring all these effects and then we're not taking into account in our market and business and policy decisions, we're just going to keep on doing it. It's out there. It's outside of our economy, outside our policy, outside of our businesses. It carries on. So we carry on doing the same thing. And that, of course, means we continue with those damages to ecosystems, biodiversity, and even threats to protected areas. And that cycle carries on and on and on. And of course, we're going to see declining ecological and natural capital, rising ecological scarcity, which means those valuable goods and services start to disappear. And then finally, we have on a global scale what we're facing today, increasing global environmental risks that we're all familiar with. And of course, what this means is we're squandering that valuable natural and ecological capital, which is fundamental to livelihoods and our own economies. And it's leading to greater economic and business risks as these environmental risks carry on. And so what we need to do is reverse the cycle. That's got to be the fundamental challenge of the 21st century. In my view, it's ending the underpricing of natural landscape is fundamental to getting nature-based solutions going, or any type of nature-oriented economy. And so I propose strategies to do this, and they all revolve around a similar sort of process. First of all, let's target the worst offenses, which is the environmentally harmful subsidies. We need to phase them out. And in the case of biodiversity and land use, we need to focus on environmentally harmful agriculture and forestry subsidies. In addition, forestry and other land uses may not be subsidized, but their damage to the environment is still ignored. We need to tax those other land uses that causes damages or an overexploitation of natural resources and biodiversity loss to control those damages. These two activities actually will raise or save money, and that money is what could go into increasing nature-based solutions on the scale that we've been talking about at this conference. So this is a three-part strategy, which I think is at the heart of trying to embed nature-based solutions in our economies and embed our economies within nature. So we clearly have challenges and opportunities here. With regard to step one, the scale of environmentally harmful agricultural subsidies and forestry subsidies are huge. 520 billion per year for agricultural subsidies and over 155 billion per year for environmentally harmful forestry subsidies. So there's plenty of opportunity here in all economies to look carefully at these subsidies and scale them back and phase them out. And then we're starting to see some element of progress on step two. Again, the OECD has tracked biodiversity relevant taxes in 59 countries since 1980. And the good news is they're on the rise. The bad news is that they are still too small and underutilized. In fact, they're the smallest amount of environmental taxing that's going on is those that are relevant to the biodiversity. We had higher pollution taxes and carbon taxes, of course, but biodiversity relevant taxes to control nature damaging activities is relatively low. And it only raises 7.5 billion a year. And that is a small fraction, again, of environmentally relevant taxes. So there's challenges here and opportunities. We need to do more in this scale. The other failure that I mentioned is the underfunding of nature. And I've touched on this before, that funding from all sources around the world, public and private, amount to about at most $90 billion per year, maybe a little bit more in some years. But if you look at the immediate funding needs, the cost of tropical nature-based solutions, which I've estimated based on Bronson Griscom's and Jonah Bush's work, to be over $600 billion per year. That's how much we need for cost-effective carbon nature-based solutions in tropics. Restoring the degraded landscape, I believe this figure is from World Resources Institute, from Helen Ding and colleagues' work. That's about $350 billion a year. And then there was recently a study suggesting that if we want to reduce pandemic risk from loss of natural habitat, that would cost us another $10 billion a year. Together, the funding needs are almost $970 billion. So that means that our funding gap between what we need to do to protect nature, the very limit, and what we're currently doing is about $900 billion. Now, reallocating and ending agricultural and forestry subsidies that are environmentally harmful would make up a lot of this difference. It would meet much of this funding gap. But we could also focus on some of the funding sources too. For one, although it sounds a lot, $68 billion, public domestic finance in countries themselves. I'm not talking about international finance, but within countries, that needs to be boosted by innovative policies. And I'll talk a little bit about one possible policy a little bit later on. But more importantly, look how small private finance is. And the biggest priority must be to find more private sector finance for NbS. Woefully slow, woefully small, particularly in tropical developing countries. So just to summarize, if we want to now focus on ending the underfunding, we must recognize the fact that we can't go on with 85% or more of our nature-based solutions funded only from public sources. That's just not sustainable, and that's not going to meet the funding gap. We have to close the funding gap overall, and we can do that by ending and reallocating environmentally harmful subsidies. We need to find new sources of funding, especially from the private sector, and we need to target key ecosystems in tropical developing countries. Now, on this last point, I want to turn to peatlands, because when you look at specific key ecosystems, such as peatlands, you start to see that the challenge isn't as bad as we think. It's still a challenge, but there is some hope for how we can get around boosting the scale and the amount of nature-based solution funding. So again, based on Branson Griscom and Jonah Bush's and colleagues' work, I was able to, with Joe Burgess, look at how much would we need for cost-effective nature-based solutions that both save biodiversity and reduce carbon through conserving or restoring peatlands in tropical countries, which is where the most important remaining peatlands are left, and where they're under the greatest threat, and also where these peatlands are so important for both storing carbon and for biodiversity. And the answer is that if we, from both carbon mitigation from peatland restoration and from peatland conservation, we could, if we did cost-effective nature-based solution in tropical countries, reduce carbon emissions by about 800 billion tons per year. And that, by the way, is I should say, is equivalent to Germany's annual emissions. So that's a huge contribution right there. That would involve, however, an additional annual cost of about $28 billion for peatland conservation and another $12 billion for peatland restoration. Now, that sounds like an awful lot, and there's a lot of countries involved, but what's really interesting is just 8 major countries would be contributing to most of this. I mean, they count, these 8 countries, which I've listed above, account for 95% of the carbon mitigation that we would achieve. And so if we focused our efforts globally on these 8 countries, and by all means for all countries, but particularly these 8 countries, we could do an awful lot with nature-based solutions. And of course, it's much easier to have for the global community to focus on trying to a strategy for peatland conservation restoration, working with 8 countries, first the major countries, and then adding in additional countries that want to participate. I also mentioned that there needs to be ways of raising more money within countries. That's domestic public financing of nature-based solutions. Now, in richer countries, such as here in the UK, and particularly in Scotland, there has been a huge effort to put money into nature-based solutions. And as Natalie mentioned, there's a session later on talking about that. So the domestic financing within rich countries for nature-based solutions is not a problem. What about in tropical countries? How can tropical countries raise more money when they're often poor countries? Well, one thing that has been tried and which could be used more extensively to fund nature-based solutions is something that colleagues and I call a tropical carbon tax. This is a levy placed on fossil fuels in tropical countries with some of the proceeds allocated to nature-based solutions. So you tax imports of fossil fuels and you put some of that money towards funding nature-based solutions, plus other needs in your economy. This is not just theory, it's actually been done by 2 low and middle income countries. Costa Rica adopted this policy way back in 1997, and Colombia did it more recently in 2016. My colleagues and I estimate if other major tropical countries adopted this policy, they could easily raise $2 to $13 billion per year domestically to fund nature-based solutions. And the value of these countries doing it is not just that they can fund nature-based solutions, but such investments essentially are demonstrating in their economies that they're placing a value on nature and its services, and they send a market signal that ecological capital is a valuable economic asset. So what Colombia and certainly Costa Rica have discovered is once you start doing that, the private sector will respond, and they will start to also invest complementary. More importantly, these policies can be designed to be pro-poor. So for example, in Costa Rica, 40% of the beneficiaries through their payments for ecosystem services, which is funded through this mechanism, 40% of the beneficiaries are communities that live below the poverty line. And so they deliberately designed the policy to target the poorest in the rural areas. Now, we also should take into account that the economic benefits of nature-based solutions are wider than just the values of the ecosystem goods and services protected. So what we're finding is that conservation investments provide much needed economic benefits, particularly jobs. So one study just for the United States showed that ecosystem restoration provides direct employment to 126,000 workers and generates $9.5 billion in economic output annually. It's a growing market sector in its own right. In addition, this expenditure and investment creates further 95,000 indirect jobs. So by spending on restoration, you need tools, you need equipment, and that boosts those industries that provide the tools, equipment, and other materials you need. And of course, it also, you create more jobs, you create more spending. So the households that receive the money as workers and employees, they generate $15 billion in additional household spending. But that's the United States. A study by researchers from the International Monetary Fund finds also the conservation investment in developing countries increase even greater, wider economic returns. So their study looked at 16 low and middle income countries, and for every dollar spent in conservation, every dollar invested in conservation, almost $7 more are generated in the wider economy after just 5 years. So that's not just the benefits of the ecosystem services, that's the wider benefits from jobs, from increased livelihoods, and so forth. Okay, now I want to turn my attention to an important segment that I've touched on already, which is the role of the private sector. What's happening with the private sector? Why are they not financing more, and how can we get them to scale up and increase their spending on nature-based solutions? Well, what's starting to happen in the private sector is a growing recognition that business risks and environmental risks are intertwined. So the World Economic Forum during a couple years ago released their nature-based economy report, and they found that out of the $44 trillion of global value added in 163 industrial sectors, almost all of it is moderately, all this money is moderately or highly dependent on nature and services. When they trace back the supply chain of this global value added, this amount was more or less dependent somewhere along the line on nature and its services, at the beginning, somewhere in the middle, or even at the end. Now you can dispute this number. It may be, has a lot of error bars on it, but the number is huge. It amounts to over half of the world's GDP. So with all the focus now on supply chain problems and all of this, the business community is starting to take, and specific industries are starting to take notice of this nature and services risk to its supply chain. On the positive side, there's also been increasing studies showing that when companies take on board environmental risk, when they include environmental risks in their overall cost of capital, and they find that that increasingly it's having an effect on that cost of capital as well as their attractiveness to potential investors. There was a meta-analysis of published studies that showed a positive relationship between corporate sustainability and financial performance in almost over 3/4 of the studies. And then from the other end, there's those that finance industries. So the financial investors, institutions, and regulators are increasingly saying we need to take into account environmental risks. And there's been a surge of interest in green finance. And the World Bank has focused on this and has found out that investors looking for investment opportunities are focusing more and more on conservation, restoration, sustainable use of nature. And they're trying to direct some of them, their financial flows, away from projects with negative impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services and towards projects that mitigate negative impacts. So there's a number of business opportunities there. The same World Economic Forum report says, yes, it will cost businesses a huge amount of money to transition to being more nature sensitive. It would cost almost $3 trillion annually worldwide. But again, the economic returns are high. They would deliver over $10 trillion in annual business opportunities and a huge number, almost 400 million jobs. And the Food and Land Use Coalition found the same thing just for food and land use system. If they made a transition to more nature positive investments, there's a $4.5 trillion. So a few years ago, my colleagues and I also investigated what would be the financial incentive for very key industries to invest in biodiversity conservation. And we found out that for 3 major industries that have a stake in the environment, seafood industry, forest products, and insurance, the potential gains could be significant. So on the right-hand column, we calculated if these industries each put in a certain amount of dollars annually, what would they get in return? So for example, if the seafood industry invested $5 to $10 billion annually to increase marine biomass stocks, what would they actually get out of it? Other than the feeling that they've done well for nature. Well, we find out that they could increase their annual profits by $53 billion. Similarly, if the forest products industry invested $15 to $30 billion, they would be able to attain the forest management goals, which is compatible with their current revenue scheme. The insurance industry would also gain $5 to $10 billion annually to increase the area of protected natural coastal wetlands, to increase natural barriers to storms, would reduce global flood damage, which is a huge drain on the insurance industry globally. So it would reduce those estimated global flood damages loss that the industry has to pay out by $52 billion annually. We also couldn't calculate the gains to agriculture, but we also found that, agriculture would already gains anywhere in the neighborhood of $200 to $600 billion annually from wild and managed pollination. And that would easily mean that they could afford investing 20 to 60 billion in protecting these habitats. Some of these industries are already making some moves. Some of you may be familiar with the CBOS initiative, where it was launched in 2016, and the aim is more sustainable management of seafood resources in the oceans for the industry. And so the C4 Business Initiative involves 10 of the 13 largest seafood companies in the world that control 16% of the global marine catch and 40% of the most valuable stocks in the world. They're all on board with this, and they are also finding ways to work with scientists to figure out how can they invest more and protect those 40% stocks that are important to their industry. And the two elements that seem to be driving this process is co-design, where the scientists and business representatives continue to work together and to listen to each other to figure out a way forward. And the second is using science-based data and analysis to both publish relevant scientific knowledge to this enterprise and also to be used by the industries to manage their operations. Finally, I'd like to talk about innovative financing. So again, like I said, the private sector needs to boost its contribution to global nature-based solution investments. It's woefully small at the moment. And there's a number of ways in which it could do this, from biodiversity offsets to more direct involvement in payments for ecosystem services, and so on, to all sorts of contributions. So my time is limited, and I just want to talk about two of these, which I think have a lot of potential, which are now currently underutilized. One is biodiversity offsets, and the other is green bonds. Both, I think, are directly relevant to nature-based solutions and can be used more than they currently are. So many of you will know what biodiversity offsets are, but essentially what you do with a biodiversity offset is you conserve or restore ecosystems to offset losses caused by your investments elsewhere. So basically, if a company finds that its operations is leading to loss of some tropical forests, they could invest in restoring or conserving tropical forests elsewhere to offset the losses. Currently, only $5 billion globally is done on this, and almost all of it, the good news, it is a major private sector mechanism. The bad news is that it's mainly within wealthy countries. And I'm afraid that's not good enough. It needs to be expanded in scale, and it needs to be targeted for more funding of nature-based solutions, and also targeted more towards low and middle income countries. Some groups like the World Bank are starting to work with host countries in low and middle income countries and the private sector to figure out ways of increasing biodiversity offsets where there is some partnership between international lending, private financing, and also local host governments. And I think this needs to be some area where we focus on in order to raise both the total amount of global funding by biodiversity offsets and to target where we really need it right now, which is in tropical developing countries. Green bonds are also a very interesting case. If you've been following the green financial literature or the ESG investment literature, you'll see that green bonds are one of the big talking points. And essentially what green bonds are, they're just like any other bond. They're a debt instrument. And you basically release a green bond to finance or refinance a project. The difference is the green bond is for financing or refinancing a project that is environmentally beneficial. In increasingly local and national governments, here in Europe in particular, I got to be careful, UK and Europe, realities. Increasingly, local and national governments and corporations are issuing green bonds to do exactly this. And multilateral development agencies and banks are involved. So the European Investment Bank is a big player, and as are some of the other regional banks. Now, this market is so big, it's now 250 to 300 billion, and this is actually now probably outdated. It's probably even more now. But it's big enough that there's an actual dedicated exchange for green bonds, which is the Green Exchange of Luxembourg stock market. That's the good news. The bad news is almost all of this green bond, it's called green bonds, but it's almost all for climate-related investments. It's rarely used at the moment to finance biodiversity conservation and sustainable land use, let alone specific, really endangered ecosystems that need NbS, such as peatlands. And so here we have an opportunity to use green bonds for funding nature-based solutions. The problem is that many biodiversity conservation projects and investments and projects are at a small scale, and they're scattered over the landscape. So these green bond instruments are better suited for large-scale investments such as in renewable energy or clean transport or public transportation, cycling or charging stations, and so on, which require a huge amount of investment. Small projects that are clustered around and spread over the landscape, and in developing countries, they're not getting the money from green bonds. So how do we change this? Well, what we need to do is think about putting forward a portfolio of conservation investments. So for peatland conservation and restoration, if we took peatlands and said, here's a peatland project in this part of the country, this part, and we presented it as a portfolio, then we could use green bonds to raise the money for the entire portfolio of investments. And a countrywide program of payment for ecosystem services, biodiversity and carbon offsets, protected areas could also be included in which case you now have a large-scale type of a portfolio that could then be used to raise money through green bonds. And this is, again, not something that's theoretical. The World Bank is already starting to experiment, and they've done this in several countries, Mexico and so forth. And we need to see more of this. And then finally, there's international assistance. We obviously need to provide more international financial technical support to low and middle income countries that adopt policies and actions for improved nature-based solution investment and management. And that includes providing support when countries demonstrate that they're willing to tackle those environmentally harmful subsidies and also control the damaging activities of their commercial sectors. And so essentially, if a country demonstrates that it is ready through its policies to do those first two steps I talked about, controlling environmentally and phasing out environmentally harmful subsidies, and also controlling environmentally damaging land uses, then they may be demonstrating sustainable nature-based solution readiness, in which case assistance should then be ready to go, flow to those countries to support that. So what has to happen is that countries need to first devise a national strategy of policy actions for conservation, restorations, and sustainable management of ecosystems, that three-step strategy that I talked about, and then establish accurate and transparent monitoring, reporting, and verifying of the results of that strategy, and then that gets financed by a whole range of donors. This is not pie in the sky. Again, this is exactly what the World Bank's carbon marketed preparedness market for carbon action policy is doing with regard to carbon. We should be doing the same thing with biodiversity. And in our peatlands report, Joe Burgess and I actually explain this strategy for peatlands, that basically there's three elements here. First is the countries, with the help of international donors like the World Bank and others, put forward that three-part strategy. And that three-part strategy, once it's in place and shows its readiness, then the international assistance should be forthcoming. And that is essentially the donors recognizing that a country is ready for increased financing of its sustainable peatlands. And then, of course, both the private and public sector should be willing to jump in together to support more and more support of peatlands in the different ways that I described earlier. And this means collective action by all countries with peatlands and their stakeholders. And of course, that would do two things. It would obviously lead to more peatlands conservation and restoration, but it would also tackle the problem of undervaluing and underfunding peatlands globally. And it would essentially make peatlands a global nature-based solution. And I've used peatlands because that's an example, but we could think of any other critical ecosystem that we would want to protect. So I want to end with some few remarks, and then I'd be happy to take some questions. Basically, nature-based solutions are a triple win for climate, biodiversity, and people. I think everybody in this room knows that. The last 2 days, and certainly today, will demonstrate that even further. But they can only succeed, nature-based solutions, with urgent attention to the two economic failures that underline our fragile Earth. That's the underpricing and underfunding of nature. Unless we're willing to go straight to the heart of the problem and tackle these two economic failures, we're not going to succeed in getting nature-based solutions to where we want it to be. And we're not going to get to the ultimate goal, which is embedding our economies within nature. So I tried to demonstrate that there's a three-step strategy that's behind all of this that we could put into place. And again, just to remind you, it involves removing environmentally harmful subsidies, taxing and regulating environmentally harmful activities, particularly those in land use that are affecting ecosystems and biodiversity, and then recycle the revenues back to invest in nature-based solutions. And this is something that should not be left to governments alone. The private sector needs to get involved. They need to see that this is part of their future just as well. Thank you very much.
My name's Michael Cherry. I wanted to ask about, your argument seems to hinge on recycling current subsidies and directing them towards nature-based solutions. What prospect do you think realistically there is of achieving this in North America and in Europe? Because many, many countries in the developing world have done that already, not the recycling part, but they've abolished the subsidies. And even countries like Australia have abolished agricultural subsidies. But North America and Europe, they seem to be completely ingrained. So that's the question.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, to be honest, many of those subsidies of the 1.8 trillion, I'm afraid many of them are in low and middle income countries today, and some of the largest ones still. They're just more hidden than the countries would like you to believe. So there's work to be done everywhere, but you're absolutely right. North America and Europe need to do more. And I think that it's a bit like a shell game at the moment. We're not focusing our attention on environmentally harmful subsidies, maybe with fossil fuels, but we're not focusing on that aspect of our economies. It's the hidden part. And I think what we need to do is to put increased pressure, provide more evidence of these subsidies and the harm they're doing, and to keep the focus on that, to put the pressure. Last time I checked, North America and Europe were still democracies, and we have a voice and we have a way of focusing our attention of our policy and our leaders on this. And I don't think the focus should be just on governments. It needs also be on businesses. Some of the interesting pressures for removing fossil fuel subsidies is actually, in some parts of North America and Europe, are coming from certain elements of the private sector as well. And for example, in the United States, the Security and Exchange Commission, not exactly the most environmentally friendly group, has basically put forward proposals for all businesses mandatory to take on board climate risks. We need to have the same thing happen with biodiversity risks and land use risks. Unfortunately, biodiversity and land use is still being down the policy scale. Everyone's more aware of the climate risks and the climate costs and increasingly of our fossil fuel dependency and fossil fuel subsidies. But all those other subsidies I talked about, we don't talk about them and their environmental harm, and particularly their harm to biodiversity and land use change. And I think that's something that has to happen. We have to have that discussion quickly. Yes, please.
So yesterday, in the finance section, they were asked to the speakers were asked to clarify between finance and funding. And the issue with the private sector is that they're only dealing with finance and not funding, and that's falling on governments. Do you have a suggestion for how the private sector can engage more with funding?
Yes.
Because I didn't.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in North America, there's another category. I lumped it all together under private, but there's two categories. There is private financing, where offsets and green bonds would come in. And there is also philanthropic funding, which is where large corporations give money through foundations, often for charitable reasons, in order to fund more in green investments of all kind. So you're right, there's two different categories. Particularly in North America, the philanthropic funding is a huge part. I personally think there's much more in the argument of business risks and the environment. And I think that the more I talk to people at the World Economic Forum, which I'm involved with, and with business leaders, and I give talks to ESG investors, there's a growing recognition that financing is at risk from the environment, from environmental risks. And I think that's a way to unlock a lot of financing. But you're absolutely right. We should also be aware of the limits of that and what can it do and what won't it do. And one of the biggest limits is that there's not enough going for biodiversity and land use. And one of the biggest needs is not just in northern countries where the interest is, but in tropical developing countries. So how do we unlock private investor long-term commitments and financing of green investments for nature, conservation and restoration in tropical developing countries? And that means involving their private sector as well.
There's a question from the online audience now, Ed, if that's okay. I just want to make sure. There's a question here about transformative change. So Diego Pacheco, who is head of the Bolivian delegation yesterday, made the comment that we can't solve the problems we face by sticking to the same approaches or mindsets which produce these problems in the first place. Can we fix capitalism with capitalist approaches in essence? So would you be able to reflect on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem is that one of the arguments you hear is that, we shouldn't take into account nature in our business and market decisions because that's commoditizing nature. And we want to, that is the old mindset. That's keeping nature outside of our economy. Yet the reality is this: we've already commoditized nature because, one, we're paying industries to destroy nature through environmentally harmful subsidies, and secondly, we're not controlling those commercial activities that are destroying nature. So already we're putting a price on nature, and it's negative. What we need to do is recognize, first of all, what is the value that nature provides to us, and then find ways, innovative ways of punishing those or taking away the subsidies to those that are destroying nature. And then secondly, investing the money into conserving and restoring nature where we can. That's the only way we're going to change this. Because right now, we are putting a price on nature. It's negative, and we're destroying it, and that's what's got to change. Thank you.
Good morning, sir. My name is Msonda Kapena, and I'm from Zambia in Africa.
Nice.
The situation in Zambia is that every vehicle that is imported into the country pays what we call a carbon tax. And that was meant to create a pool that goes into financing or funding environmental activities and mitigations within the country. But that money goes now into central government and is used for any other business. So how what would you advise? I know it's a governmental internal issue, but then as a third eye, what would be the best way to unlock that money so that we don't heavily rely on external donors and funders and philanthropists? Thank you.
Right. Well, that's a great question, and it's exactly the problem. Is that that's only part of the solution that we need. The first part is okay, taxing, using carbon tax to raise money. The bad side, where it goes wrong, it sounds like in Zambia, is that some of that money is not being allocated towards environmental investments where it should be. And I think a lot of countries that implement that type of policy, they simply have not designed the policy correctly. That's why the type of strategy that I talk about, where you get not governments and private sector funding investments per se, but helping the technical expertise in the country to design the correct system of taxing and refunding, recycling the money for environmental investments. And that's exactly what the World Bank is doing with many countries through its carbon market readiness preparedness program for carbon markets. I envision the same type of program for biodiversity investments, where basically some outside entity provides advice, assistance to help develop first the correct taxing mechanism, second the correct recycling of the taxing, making sure it does go to environmental investments, and third, and most importantly, long-term monitoring and valuation of those projects to make sure A, they're going to the poorest in those communities, and B, that they're actually delivering on the environmental protection and restoration that we want. And that has to be an entire program design, which is an area that we often overlook. It's not just putting more money in for investment. It's not just saying, let's impose a tax. We have to have the whole policy designed correctly. And from that's where the most important role of financial assistance and technical assistance from the international community can come from, and even the private sector.
That's fantastic. I think what we'll do is I'll have one more question now, bearing in mind that Ed is also taking part in the session that will immediately follow the coffee break. So you'll have more opportunities both during coffee and during the next session. Who shall, yeah, at the back there. Yeah, it's fine. Yes.
I'll take this. Hi, it's James Lloyd from Nature for Climate. Thank you very much for that work. It's really interesting to see some of your numbers. And I was interested because the G7 has consistently talked about subsidy shift. And I'm calling it shift because the livelihoods are critical, that we just don't just pull the subsidies of some of the farmers there. So it's about shifting them to more nature positive. But we've had no movement in the G20 at all.
Yep.
So levy, tax, whatever we call it, on fossil fuels for G20, I can't see it moving, the political reality there. However, interestingly, you talk about separating biodiversity from climate finance. My argument is actually we should keep them together, because most of the flows are through climate finance, and get them to recognise the critical role of nature in delivering net zero. And if you look at the GFAN's commitment of 130 trillion assets under management in Glasgow, only about 9 trillion of that was committed to halting deforestation by 2025.
Correct.
Which is a huge step. And 9 trillion is a lot bigger than the billions we were talking earlier, in a sense. So I think this is important, and it's just trying to think, how would you talk to GFANs to make the case, and potentially FI boardrooms, of the critical role of nature within due diligence, and ultimately creating a new asset class for nature, because or nature positive, because that's failing here, because they haven't got the teams working on this area. And it'd just be interesting, what are the key points you would be making to that case?
Oh, thank you.
Or
That's
maybe
an
are
excellent
making.
question. Well, first, your first point, hopefully I was not trying to give the impression to separate biodiversity from climate. What I was saying is that we have the problem is that we're underfunding biodiversity. The point that you're making in your statement is that we need to do more for the biodiversity side, precisely because so many biodiversity finances are connected, and land use investments are connected to also saving the climate. That's some of the figures I showed at the beginning. So that's incredibly important. I was asked by the UN during the 2000 9 Great Recession to write their Global Green New Deal report. And one of the first things I pointed to was the need for the G20 to reduce fossil fuel subsidies. And I've made that plea many times since then. I've now changed my tune a little bit because I realize the G20, and I have an article that will hopefully come out, or a blog post that will emphasize this, is I think what we're seeing is that the color of democracy is green. And that cuts both ways. When you look, and I've done the figures, and you look at the recent trends in terms of who's investing, which countries are investing, and ending the underpricing of fossil fuels, ending dependency in fossil fuels, and investing green, both in land use and climate, you see overwhelmingly it's democratic countries. And that's even more stark in the G20. So I actually think the hope is for the Western Europe, North America, Japan, Australia now, and other democracies, South Africa possibly, and some of those democratic countries and low and middle income countries, to join together and recognize the future for them is green, for both their economies and their democracies, and to unlock the type of strategy that I'm talking about with thinking carefully about where do we put this assistance and how do we boost it, particularly for land use change and biodiversity, which, as you say, is so critical. And equally with the business world, I think that there is this growing recognition their supply chains are vulnerable. The lessons they've taken from the recent few years is that the pandemic has shown them how supply chains are under threat, and the environmental risks they're very much aware of. And they're also aware of the growing pressure on regulation and more pressure from their investors. And that's our way in to get the business community to think more. They're starting to see that business risks and environmental risks are joined together. And I think that's the message we need to point to them.
That's a great answer, great question, great answer, and a great place to stop. We'll certainly be tackling those issues, those very issues about business engagement in session 9A today, so it's great to mention that. We'll let you have some coffee now. We'll let you all have some coffee. If you could come back here by 10:35-ish, that would be great. And just a quick request not to bring any big biscuits in here from the museum. Apparently this attracts pests and can harm the exhibits, so just to remind you of that. Have a great break, and thanks very much, Ed. A round of applause for it.
Thank you.